today's Lunch and Learn. I'm happy to welcome John Shutske from UW Extension, who is going to talk a little bit about managing stress. So I'm going to toss it over to John right away so we can optimize our time together.
And Wendy, if you give me just a second, I think I can figure out how to share my screen here, hopefully. And I go to the presentation mode, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things are a little slow. So
There
are you able to see that okay?
Yep, I can see that okay. And one other comment before we get started, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. There's also a chat feature on Zoom, so feel free to share any questions that you have through chat, and I can help John facilitate those throughout the discussion as well.
Oh, that will be awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do my best to kind of keep track of everything here. I do a fair number of these Zoom sessions every week. I've actually got a couple of meetings this afternoon, so hopefully we can keep things cooking along here. First of all, Wendy, thank you to you and Wisconsin Farm Bureau. I talk about this every time I speak to a Farm Bureau audience. I've got a long-standing, my dad was a Farm Bureau insurance agent back in the mid-1960s, and I actually worked for Farm Bureau right out of college down in Illinois, actually with the insurance company, but I had a really close affiliation with the parent organization, and then also in my 18 years over in Minnesota. So I've appreciated the relationship, and I really love working with Wisconsin Farm Bureau, along with the other ag organizations here in the state. So I know that there might be people who are watching this either right now live online or the recording who have seen me speak before, but I'm gonna just go, kind of come back to this whole idea of breaking the stress cycle. We're in the midst of a tough time right now. It's obvious to most people. This is a hot time. I've been on the road like all winter doing workshops and seminars, probably done 40 or 50 in the last calendar year. The one thing I want to say though is it's really important to note that even during really great times, when you're hustling and you're investing and you've got cash coming out your pockets because we're maybe in better times than we are today, those can also be stressful times. And especially in farming where we're dependent on so many variables that we really don't have a whole lot of control over. So in my workshops that I've been doing, I've been talking about the notion of chronic stress. A lot of work that's been done in the last 30 or 40 years is focused on the typical short-term stress that we all feel. That's certainly important. But what ends up happening with chronic stress is that when we're dealing with weather and financial hardships and all of the things that a farmer has to deal with that are often beyond our control, if we're dealing with that at a high enough intensity over a long enough period of time, we enter into this cycle of chronic stress, which can lead to depression and the additional risk for addiction and even potentially suicide. The other problem with chronic stress is it truly becomes a vicious cycle in that chronic stress changes our brain. It actually does some to like rewire or change the brain structure. And then the result of that is we end up making bad decisions, and those bad decisions have consequences, and it just further fuels this response. And so the question is like, how do we break ourselves out of this cycle? And again, this cycle can happen in good times or in bad. So that's kind of been the theme of a lot of the work that I've been doing. The one thing is we've got a limited time period here. We got about 20, 25, 30 minutes. I'm not going to be able to cover everything. For right now, the best source of information from me is www.agsafety.info. Just www.agsafety.info. The top link on that is this collection of all the work I've been doing, the videos, the presentations. I actually did a series of 3 or 4 videos this summer with Sarah from your communications unit. And so a lot of that is cataloged in this website. I also just want to mention for Wisconsin Farm Bureau members and maybe some of our extension colleagues who might end up watching this, we are in the midst of a fairly major effort. We hope to have a website finalized by a week from Thursday, so the middle part of April, on farm stress. And we're looking at it from we're looking at 4 different quadrants or 4 different facets. I actually want to point to these using a laser pointer if I'm able to do that. Can you see that, Wendy? Yeah? Okay.
Yes, we can. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself.
Oh, no, that's okay. So we have, so we're obviously today we're talking about brain science and biology as well as stress management. But we also recognize that there may be people who watch this that are ag service providers or Farm Bureau leaders, either paid leaders or farmer leaders who are part of committees and things like that, but they might be communicating and being looked at as resources in their community. So what are some of those resources for crucial conversations and how to actually have some of these really difficult discussions? And people get stuck and don't really know how to talk about some of these complicated things. And the other thing that we're adding to this array are these financial planning tools. I can only take things so far as a agricultural health and safety professional, but obviously an extension and some of our partner organizations, we have a whole bunch of other resources to help people think through different alternatives, putting pen to paper, getting bigger, getting smaller, changing your operation, transitioning from one generation to another, or possibly even making some more difficult decisions like actually getting out of farming. So when we talk about this vicious cycle, I'm going to skip a lot of the kind of brain science. And again, if you want to watch those videos that Sarah and I recorded on a really hot August day last summer, you can do that. But when we are under stress, our brain and body work together to release a couple of different hormones. And we all know these. One of them is adrenaline. Adrenaline makes our heart beat faster, it raises our blood sugar, it increases our blood pressure, it kind of speeds us up and gets us ready and motivated to do something. The other one is cortisol. And these two chemicals working together, they're hormones, prepare us to either run away from the threat or to fight, to really try to battle whatever's happening and make a difference and survive, hopefully. And then the other problem is that under a large enough amount of both adrenaline and cortisol together, in some cases it has such an effect on our brain that we actually freeze up, we panic. And it becomes very difficult to make the kinds of critical decisions. We can't think smart, we can't have good conversations, or if we're in a marriage, we might say things that are stupid, or just because we're under that influence of these stress hormones. And again, that can further fuel this cycle. One of the positive things is when we get ourselves into this cycle, or when we get ourselves into a stressful situation, it's really good that we're not constantly stressed out, because otherwise, it becomes difficult to function. And this long-term stress has impacts on our health and, again, our communications and relationships. So thankfully, our body, our brain actually specifically, has receptors. They're like little swatches of Velcro. And these grab onto these hormones, especially cortisol, and it's like a thermostat. It tells the brain, kind of crank it down a little bit. We've got enough stress going, and we can crank it down to kind of go back to our normal lives. The problem is, after a while, under the constant pressure of chronic long-term stress, these little thermostats, these little receptors that tell the brain to chill out, they become fewer in number and they become far less effective. And again, that's where we get ourselves into this vicious cycle. And one of the impacts is with respect to decision-making and conversations. We have this frontal part of our brain. It's called the prefrontal cortex. People who watch this who have teenagers at home might relate to this. The prefrontal cortex is like the last part of our brain to fully develop. It's one of the reasons why teenagers and adolescents have such a difficult time making smart decisions and having a productive conversation with their parents or with other adults. And it's because of the importance of this prefrontal cortex. It also, in the case of financial decision making, it acts like it's like a scratch pad. It allows us to bring information forward from the other parts of the brain, like our hippocampus, which is responsible for memory, and to think through, like, okay, do I want to expand my operation, or do I need to go in and look at alternative financing options, or maybe legal structure? And cortisol especially tends to numb that front part of the brain and make it far less accessible, and also just able to carry out these crucial functions. And again, that's where we enter into this vicious cycle. So I'm actually going to back up to this slide. So the question then is, and I often use the picture, some of you may have seen this, a picture of a John Deere 4020. It's a throttle. Was my favorite tractor as a kid growing up. So the question is, you got all this fuel, the cortisol and the adrenaline, like where's the throttle lever to be able to throttle it in the other direction and break this vicious cycle. This is kind of the unique part of the work that I've been doing, is to help people think about how do we break the cycle so that this doesn't continue to escalate and lead to some of these really negative outcomes that we see. Again, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail here. The most critical thing is the notion of control. And in my workshops, I do this long story about rat research, and I'm actually going to summarize it here. Don't try this at home. This is the kind of research now that was probably done at places like Stanford or the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Back in the 1960s, if you tried to do this research now, you'd probably get busted by the federal government or PETA or some of the other animal rights, animal welfare organizations. But back in the day, they did this research, and let's just imagine that we have 3 groups of rats, 100 rats or 100 individuals in each group. The one group, the first group that I'll talk about, is the control rats. They live in little cages, they're healthy and happy, and they're well fed, and they're kept warm enough in the winter, cool enough in the summer. The second group, sadly, is in a cage that is exposed to little electrodes at the bottom of the cage. And these electrodes, about 50 or 60 times a day at randomly timed intervals, these rats get zapped with the shock. High voltage, low amperage, so it's not going to kill the rat, but it is like a cattle prod or an electric fence. It's very disconcerting. It's going to snap. You're going to probably have an audible noise associated with it. And these rats are going to be really uncomfortable. You have a third group of rats that are in those same kinds of cages, but they have a little light bulb that they can see if they look up. And also there's a little, like a brake pedal. And what happens is a couple of seconds before the shock is going to be administered by a computer controlled device, the light comes on and they can reach out and push this brake pedal. However, the brake pedal only works about 30% of the time. So 70% of the time they push the brake pedal and they don't have any control. But 30% of the time they do. And so the question then is, which group of rats is going to have the best outcome? It's obvious the control group, they're going to live their normal rat lives. They're going to live 2, 3, 4 years. They're going to be relatively healthy and happy. The group that has no control, that gets zapped 60 times a day, zero control, they're going to die within a matter of weeks or probably not more than a couple of months. And if you do an autopsy of those rats after they have passed, after they've died, you're going to find massive stomach ulcers and lesions. If you look at the brain, you'll find that there are parts of the brain that appear to be missing, like they've actually had such impact by the cortisol especially, that it's actually shrunk the parts of the brain to where you can't even find where that part of the brain was located. The third group that has control, but only 30% of the time, if you compare their lifespan and outcome, statistically, they're going to be almost identical to the control group. And what that says, and again, there have been hundreds of similar research studies that have been done over the last 50 or 60 years. What it suggests to us is if you can find specific ways to regain some sense of control, that is just super crucial for managing stress. That sounds like totally obvious, but what's not obvious, you don't have to have complete control. In the case of the rats, they only had control 30% of the time. And frankly, in agriculture, there is so much out there that you simply don't have control over. It's kind of like the serenity prayer, the whole notion of being able to differentiate between controllable things and uncontrollable things, having the wisdom to do that, and also the wisdom to be able to focus on the things that you can control. Again, it sounds super simplistic, but just so amazingly critical. One of the activities we've been working on, I've got time to just run through this really quickly. I've been carrying around, I have bought out all of the dollar store here in the Madison area, their paper plates, because I've been doing a lot of these workshops. I carry around paper plates. I ask participants to take a paper plate. I hand them out to them. Everybody gets excited thinking that we're going to eat brownies or have some kind of snack, but it's just for this exercise. You can do this at home, or if you've got a small group of Farm Bureau members in your county or a local area, you can do this. Draw a line down the middle. Doesn't have to be a perfect dotted line like the one here. And then what I have people do is write down on the left-hand side what are the things that stress you out? Like, what are the things that just really, kind of gnaw at you and cause those day-to-day stresses, and maybe week to week, or things that are just really, really difficult for you to deal with? I always tell people, if you need a second plate, we probably need to talk. So I think it's also a good opportunity to do this as a group, where you have some opportunities for interaction. And then what I ask people to do is to be really thoughtful and circle the things that you do have control over. So many of the things that we fuss and worry about, we're perseverating on those, but if we don't have control, we're going to be that rat that just kind of wastes. And to really focus your time and energy and your health, and I'm going to come back and talk about health in a minute, but focus on those things that you can best control. The other thing that I've been doing here lately is, too often in these moments that we're in right now in agriculture, is we don't step back and reflect on the things that bring us joy. It could be family. For me, honestly, it's bluegrass music and baseball this time of the year. My children just give me such great joy. And in some cases, by just simply listing those 5 or 6 things, in many cases, we've got farm couples. It's like, thank you for having us do that, because since Christmas time, we've just been so absorbed with getting our operating loans lined up, and to just step back and spend that few minutes can really make a huge difference. I'm going to spend the balance of my time then talking about what are some of these control techniques or strategies. Again, this stuff it's not rocket science, but it's stuff that often takes a back seat when we find ourselves under these really difficult emotional times. One is to plan. Sounds so obvious, and I'm going to just say it. Guys, especially, too often we say, like, we're not going to spend that couple of hours to sit down, take pen and paper or pencil and paper and really plan things out. We're just going to get out there and put our nose to the grindstone and start working. And sometimes that planning helps you to think about things a little bit differently, to set priorities, and it actually is known to make a difference. Also, don't get caught in the traps of inaction or procrastination. If I was doing this live with a big group of people, I asked for a show of hands. Some of those, we're always looking for perfect information. We're never in agriculture going to have perfect information. So get things started and overcome that sort of inertia. And once you get going with these kinds of activities, it's easier to keep things started. The other thing is, if you look at that last picture, a person writing things down by hand, too often, our younger generation, if I'm doing a workshop, I say, yeah, okay, write down 5 things, and they pull out their phone and they start putting it into a note on an iPhone or whatever it might be. But the physical action of writing things down and getting it onto paper, we know from brain science research, it makes a difference. It helps to cement memory. It also helps with commitments and follow through and that sort of thing. And so from just a simple brain science perspective, like when I'm working with students, I make them keep notes longhand. They might be able to work on their computer and stuff, but sometimes that physical action of writing things down can make a difference. As we talk about control and beginning to plan and think about the future and developing strategies and tactics for moving forward, obviously we don't want to do this alone. And yet at the same time, under these difficult times of stress, because of these stress hormones and chemicals, we often tend to withdraw just a little bit more, and we become a little bit less comfortable at reaching out and getting help, whether that's financial help, legal help, production, working with your farm organization, whether it's Farm Bureau or some other organization. I don't know if I mentioned this, Cooperative Extension obviously is a resource out there. But the more you reach out, the more you try to use stress as an opportunity to connect with other people. People who do that have better outcomes. And there's a lot of research in that area. There's actually, I don't have the slide here, there's actually an author, her name is Kelly McGonigal, and she's done a TED Talk. It's called How to Make Stress Your Friend. And she talks about all the potentially negative health impacts associated with stress, heart disease and diabetes and infection. But she says that the people who are most willing to use stress as an opportunity to reach out and connect with community, with family, with neighbors, with loved ones, those people have really good outcomes. So don't go it alone. Always make sure to reach out. One of the groups who I'm really encouraging people to reach out to is their primary healthcare provider, whether that's a physician, a doctor, family doctor, a nurse practitioner, whoever that primary person is that provides you with healthcare. If you're feeling some of the things that we're talking about here, the high levels of stress, difficulty sleeping, you might feel low energy, you might feel, frankly, depressed. And I think people know, or anxious. I think people know what those symptoms feel like. It's really important as a first step. I'm always telling people to check in with that primary provider because you want to rule out. I've had one farmer, the big issue with him, he wasn't sleeping and was tired all during the daytime and stuff like that. Could be sleep apnea, could be caffeine, it could be some type of underlying health condition. So a good doctor or nurse locally is going to get you started down that pathway of making sure that you're healthy. Wendy, I think you mentioned you also had wanted me to cover a little bit on like working and talking with other people. Again, we've got people in the audience here who might be in that position. It's really important to listen. Communication, I think everybody's heard, it's a two-way street. I don't remember exactly. God gave us one mouth and two ears, and there's a reason for that. But listening is really crucial. I used to work here in our College of Agriculture in the dean's office, and I spent the majority of my day solving problems, but I solved those problems by listening to people, and it just is really a big deal. Listen and be open. Ask questions that help people to reflect. Realize that under stress, sometimes people's priorities can just seem, like why are you worrying about that? Why are you worrying about whether or not your son parks the tractor in the area that you designated for that particular machine, whatever it might be. You've got to listen to those things to be able to get to the real roots of the problem. So listening is crucial. Listening with empathy, not pity or sympathy. We don't have time to watch this here today. There's a really fantastic, a lot of the stress workshops, I've been using this. If you go to YouTube and search the name Brene Brown and empathy, there's a really good video. It's like 2 minutes and it kind of goes through the difference between sympathy and empathy. And in terms of being a helping professional is really crucial. Just a few other things here. We talk about health. Part of health and part of managing stress is making sure we've got enough energy. Your body's just like a machine. You've got this part of your machine, the brain. It's only about 3 pounds for a typical adult, and yet it consumes about 25% of the energy. So if you're going to be thinking through things and trying to break this vicious cycle, you've got to make sure you've got the right type of nutrition. Again, as I'm out talking to people, I encourage them to think about, you got a brand new chopper like this, or it could be a grain combine or some robotic piece of milking equipment. But let's say a chopper, $500,000. Nobody would dream of heading out into the field and not thinking about okay, what kind of fuel am I going to put in this? How often am I going to need to fuel it up? And what about the quality of the fuel? Nobody would say, oh, we need fuel. Oh, I hadn't really thought about that. A mile down the road behind that old shed, Uncle Jerry's place, I think there's an old underground fuel tank from back in the 1970s. I don't know what's in it, but it certainly wouldn't hurt we just don't think that way when we think about our machinery and equipment. But that's the mistake that we make when it comes to fueling our bodies. So I'm not going to go real deep on this. Common sense tells us if our diet is 100% Snickers bars and Mountain Dew for, a fourth of the year, that's not the best thing in the world. You don't have to eat a perfect diet, but balance, eating often, eating small meals, eating lean protein, fruits, vegetables, and also staying hydrated, especially as we move into these summer months. Hydration is also a really crucial part of having enough energy and being able to manage it. I think it's also just quickly important to talk about exercise. It's kind of like a really big deal. It is like the one magic bullet. If you talk to people who are either physical health experts or mental / behavioral health experts, exercise is one of those few things that has some magical qualities to it. Exercise, if you are okay to do this per your doctor or your nurse practitioner. Aerobic exercise in particular helps with the release of chemicals called endorphins. These are natural chemicals that make you feel good. They give you a sense of energy, a sense of euphoria. We also know that exercise obviously strengthens the heart and the lungs, and it can strengthen brain function and the immune system as well. So again, if your doctor approves of it, fantastic way to begin to break this cycle. And for people who are watching, who are regular aerobic exercise, it doesn't mean you need to do aerobics, but to do some type of aerobic activity, it really makes a difference. Brain oxygenation and nourishment. And then the other thing that we now know, I'm not going to go through those today, but there's some really cool slides that show that the parts of our brain that can shrink under the presence of long-term exposure to cortisol actually rebuild in size. They get bigger in volume and they regrow these receptors or these thermostats that control the stress response. So you don't have to be a Olympic athlete. You don't need to go out and run marathons, but that couple, 3-4 times a week, 20-30 minutes where you get into some type of an aerobic zone can be super helpful. Similar meditation and mindfulness. I tell the story every time I'm out. Like, I had one guy in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he said, "I'm not going to do yoga." And I said, "What are you?" He said, and he actually said, "I'm not going to buy yoga pants," which I thought was kind of silly. I didn't understand his point, but we're not necessarily talking about doing yoga. Spending quiet time, whether it's meditation or mindfulness exercises, it does help to change and grow and strengthen the parts of our brain that are helpful for this stress response. It increases the influence of the amygdala. The amygdala is the part of the brain that's responsible for anxiety. It helps us focus on the here and now. And also this whole notion of oxygenation is really crucial. Let me just show you. So for those of you who might still be naysayers on meditation and mindfulness, I asked the question, why do we do this every November? Why do we go sit in a tree stand for 6, 8, 10 hours and snow flurries and, spitting rain? And yet we come away like with joy or with happiness. And part of it is that quiet time of reflection, being alone, being thankful and grateful for the things that we are given. And again, being able to express those in nature is really crucial. So find a way to do this, whether it's going for a walk or hanging out outside, or maybe it's inside listening to music. You got to find your own way to do this, but 15, 20 minutes a day makes a big difference. Wendy, I've just got a couple more slides here and then I'll wrap things up. Sleep, also crucial. We underestimate the value of sleep with respect to having our brain be able to kind of put things together. Our brain, gets a little bit discombobulated during the course of the day. So we need deep sleep. We need dream or REM sleep and other forms of sleep. Some of the enemies of sleep obviously are overstimulation. Don't have a really complicated, or don't be looking at financial spreadsheets like at 10 o'clock, like 5 minutes before you go to bed. Probably not a good idea. People think, I'm going to have a couple glasses of wine or a couple beers before bedtime. Alcohol might put you to sleep right away, but it's going to change the quality of your sleep. So be a little bit cautious about that. And the big one obviously is caffeine. When I say what else, this is a big offender. The light that you get off of your smartphone or your tablet in the evening, we now know from research, it stimulates the parts of your brain that kind of keep you buzzing and make it difficult to go fully asleep and get into that deep sleep zone. Changes in sleep habits might indicate some type of underlying health condition or issue. Again, can't overemphasize that enough. If you're finding yourself and you're really difficulty sleeping, think about some of these enemies of sleep, but again, also check in with your family doctor. I just wanted to throw in a couple of additional slides. Here in Wisconsin, I think we're doing a really good job of being able to talk about the risk of suicide. And yet it is kind of the tip of the iceberg. We also need to be thinking about depression and substance abuse. I know there's been like a huge amount of discussion on opioids and heroin and other prescription medications and things like that. The big substance in rural Wisconsin among our agricultural and rural communities, it remains alcohol. And so we know that all of these things are risk factors for suicide. We could probably spend a whole hour talking about some of the suicide prevention factors, but a lot of them are the things we have talked about: taking care of yourself and finding ways to break that vicious cycle. And especially if you find yourself in that vicious cycle, maybe, checking in and spending that half hour with your family doctor can make a difference. There is a national suicide prevention hotline, like lots of local resources and clergy. I have had a couple of situations this winter where I was really concerned about a couple of my audience members. Obviously, you need to do this in private, but I just said, you ask the question, are you thinking about suicide or somehow seriously harming yourself? That's not a bad question to ask. It shows you care. You're not going to push somebody over the brink. In both cases, the person kind of said, oh, no, it's bad, but it's not that bad. I've got family, I've got children. I was prepared, however, to get on the phone with them and kind of walk them through the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It is there as a resource 24/7. I have spoken to them kind of in preparation for these kinds of workshops, and they're really fantastic people. So it's a great resource. Don't be scared if you need to reach out to somebody. It is certainly one to pay attention to. So I think with that, it's probably 12:31. I'm happy to try to take a question or two or three if there are any out there.
All right. Does anyone have any questions for John? Feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat.
And I'm going to stop share, I think.
Okay. There you go.
Yeah, I do love questions. I know we need to be efficient here with our time, but if anybody does have anything, I'm more than happy to talk.
Anybody? Don't be shy. While you're coming up with your questions, I do want to thank John. I think he provided a lot of great resources and other things to look into. He talked about the empathy video from Brene Brown. I've seen that, and it really is a really great video. So don't forget to take a look at that once we are done with the Lunch and Learn today.
Wendy, I would like to, we hope to have the first part of our website as a mock-up on Thursday this week. And I know I might be dating this a little bit by talking about it, but then around the middle part of April, we'll have things fully fleshed out. I would like to be able to share that with you and make sure that it gets widely available to all of your membership. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We'd be more than willing to share that. And if anyone here on the Lunch and Learn today is interested in seeing that, we will give it to our district coordinators and hopefully spread the word that way.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, if we don't have any questions, I once again want to thank John for joining us. We will have the recording posted sometime this afternoon, so you can take a look at it. And we hope you tune in next month when our Lunch and Learn will be provided by the Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin. We'll be talking about June Dairy Month.
Thank you again, Wendy, and thank you to Wisconsin Farm Bureau. I appreciate the partnership.
Thank you.